This show is sponsored by Liquid IV. What do you pack in your bag when you're heading out for the day? Sunblock? Snacks? Sunglasses? Well, now there's another essential, Liquid IV. Liquid IV is more than just a drink. It's scientifically formulated to hydrate better than water alone. Visit liquidiv.com and stay fueled for a long day with sugar-free hydration featuring the new Raspberry Lemonade Hydration Multiplier. Get 20% off your first order with the code THERACE at checkout. When I'm travelling, I always like to have a pack of Liquid IV on me to help me stay hydrated when I'm getting on and off planes or going to and from the track. It's important for me because when travelling I am prone to suffering from dehydration and cramp if I don't use Liquid IV. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water hydrates better than water alone. It has 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 essential vitamins and nutrients that turn ordinary water into extraordinary hydration. From acai berry and lemon lime to pina colada, there are a wealth of flavours to choose from, and they are always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free and soy-free. So get ready for a long day with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code THERACE at checkout. That's 20% off your first order with code THERACE at liquidiv.com.
Hey, it's Noah Chestnut from The Athletic. If you're into games and sports, pay attention. I'm going to give you 4 sports terms. You tell me the common thread. Ready? Game, match, point, set. This one's kind of a gimme. The answer is how tennis is scored. Do you want more of a challenge? Check out Connections Sports Edition. It's a new daily game for sports fans. To play now, go to theathletic.com/connections.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to another episode of And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Matt Bishop, and sitting opposite me, poised for another epic, we hope, discussion about a pivotal moment in motor racing history is my old mate Richard Williams. How's it going, Richard?
Very good, thanks, Matt. And we've got another cracking story to unpick this week, and quite a modern one too, or at least as modern as we get on this podcast.
Yes, well, look, I mean, history is the study of past events, isn't it? So I reckon that means anything that's ever happened.
Pretty much.
Pretty much. Whether long ago or more recently. Anyway, the saga we're going to be talking about in this episode happened 17 years ago, so relatively recently, and it's another of F1's, Formula One's infamous gate controversies. You might remember that in Season 2 of Colossally, we tackled Spygate, the controversy of 2007 ostensibly involving McLaren and Ferrari, but whose intended beneficiary was actually Honda. That's why I say ostensibly. And if you want to know why I say that, then I recommend you listen to that Colossally episode if you haven't done so already. Anyway, now here we are in Season 3, and we're going to get our teeth stuck into the Crashgate controversy.
Yeah, and whether you like the term Crashgate or not, it's certainly stuck around as the shorthand term for the Singapore Grand Prix controversy of 2008, when it emerged that the Renault driver Nelson Piquet Junior deliberately crashed to hand a major sporting advantage to his teammate at the time, Fernando Alonso, who went on to win the race.
Yes, and if you're listening to this podcast as maybe a slightly newer fan of Formula One than perhaps Richard or I, and if you don't therefore know much about Crashgate, perhaps, it's worth saying that it was a pretty seismic moment in Formula One and an incident that was taken very seriously, not only from a sporting perspective, rightly so, because one of the principles of all sporting contests, not only motor racing, but all sporting contests, is surely that all competitors should be engaged in trying to win, or if actually winning isn't possible, then at least to achieve the best result possible, but also because of what the FIA certainly saw as the potentially dangerous consequences of a driver crashing deliberately, thereby endangering not only himself, but also other drivers, trackside marshals, trackside camera operators and photographers, and potentially, of course, spectators as well. All in all, therefore, what can we say? The fallout from Crashgate was, well, massive. And in one sense, it's actually still kind of going on, since the incident played its part, however large or small, in the outcome of that year's World Championship, the 2008 World Championship, which Felipe Massa lost to Lewis Hamilton by the narrowest of margins. But we'll get to all that. But first, we should probably kick off by introducing the main cast, the dramatis personae of characters in the story, Richard.
Yeah, and we'll start with Renault's team boss back then. That was the colourful and always controversial Flavio Briatore, who now, I could say puzzlingly, I could say ironically, I could even say something a bit stronger.
His lawyers might be listening, so maybe don't.
He's back 17 years later as something called executive advisor with the team based at Enstone in Oxfordshire, which is once again owned by Renault and now operates as Alpine. Back in 2008, though, Flav was the team principal, a role he'd previously held for around 10 years when the team ran as Benetton, and they'd won 2 drivers' championships and 1 constructors' title with Michael Schumacher in 1994 and 95.
I notice you call him Flav. Are you particularly good mates?
Oh, as close as this. Everybody calls him Flav, even his enemies.
Okay.
He was forced out of the role at Benetton in 1997 when he was replaced by ProDrive's David Richards, but he returned as team principal and managing director in 2000 when Renault, who you might remember had been out of Grand Prix racing as a manufacturer since 1985, announced their plans to buy the Benetton F1 operation. The team won world championships again in 2005 and 06, when Briatore led Renault to back-to-back constructors' crowns as Fernando Alonso scored consecutive drivers' titles, which put an end to the 5-year spell of dominance by Michael Schumacher and Ferrari. But after Alonso jumped ship for McLaren in 2007, as we detailed on our Spygate podcast,
Indeed,
Renault didn't win a single race. And though Briatore brought Alonso back to Renault for 2008, after a year of infighting with Lewis Hamilton and your mate Ron Dennis at Woking, the team still hadn't won a race as they approached the Singapore Grand Prix, round 15 of 18 that season. And the drought was now getting on for 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. And the Enstone team were therefore coming under intense pressure to win a race. Flavio reportedly told his senior staff that the Renault high-ups in France had informed him that unless they could win a race in the remainder of the 2008 season, they might well consider pulling out of Formula One altogether for 2009, with obviously potentially dire consequences for everyone at Enstone.
Yeah, and of course this was the time of the global financial crisis, when the corporate finances of major car manufacturers were looking far from healthy, and it was becoming harder and harder for boards of directors to okay spending north of £200 million a year on an F1 programme. You'll remember that Honda were about to drop out and Toyota were beginning to waver.
Indeed they were, yes, and BMW also left at the end of 2009, you remember.
They did.
Anyway, let's get back to Crashgate itself and the cast of characters. One of the senior Renault figures to whom Briatore would have conveyed that worrying news about Renault possibly pulling out of Formula One if a race win didn't eventuate soon is the next character in our story, Pat Symonds. Now, back in 2008, Pat was Renault's executive director of engineering and one of the team's longest-serving members of staff. He'd joined Tolman, the team that would become Benetton, that would morph into Renault in the early 1980s. And, bar a brief move to the aborted Reynolds Formula One project in the early 1990s, he'd been with the team ever since, playing a big role in all its World Championship successes. And Pat had stayed with the team when, when the other key members of Benetton's crack engineering brains trust, if I can call it that, I'm talking about, Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne particularly, had departed for Ferrari. So Pat, was very much Team Enstone through and through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was someone who'd seen the good times and the bad, the championships and the controversies that went along with them. And given his seniority within the team, he must have been feeling the pressure of the winless run more than most.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to the drivers. We've mentioned them both already, but Fernando Alonso was the team's undoubted number one and rightly regarded as one of the best drivers in the world. He'd been promoted to a Renault race drive in 2003, having been managed through the junior ranks by none other than Flavio Briatore. And interestingly, the team's other driver, Nelson Piquet Junior, was also in Flav's management stable, FFBB. So Flav, with his Renault hat on, would pay both of his drivers a decent salary, then put his FFBB hat on and recoup some of that back immediately as their manager. Nice work if you can get it. And in some other fields of human endeavour, that sort of arrangement might qualify as an impermissible conflict of interest.
Very possible, impermissible.
Piquet Junior was, of course, the son of Brazil's first three-time world champion, Nelson Piquet, who's been mentioned in several episodes of Colossally already, and not always in the most glowing terms.
No, I've probably been guilty of, or at least responsible for some of those non-glowing terms. But anyway, like his father, Piquet Junior raced for Brazil, although he was born in Germany to a Dutch mother, and he spent his early years living in Monaco. His was one of those cosmopolitan Formula One upbringings, a bit like Nico Rosberg, for example, who was born in Germany to a German mother and a Finnish father, another Formula One world champion, Keke Rosberg, and he, Nico, spent his early years living in Monaco and Ibiza. Anyway, back to Nelson Piquet Jr. Having been extremely well backed by his father, Nelsinho, as Piquet Jr. is often referred to.
Little Nelson, in other words.
Little Nelson, yeah. Indeed so. Had a decent junior career, winning the British Formula 3 title in 2004, pretty good, then finishing runner-up to Lewis Hamilton in GP2, which was the forerunner to today's Formula 2, in 2006, also pretty good. 2008 was Nelsinho's rookie season in Formula 1, and he hadn't found it at all easy, especially with the brilliant Fernando, a double Formula 1 world champion already, remember, as his teammate. So heading into the soon-to-be infamous Singapore Grand Prix of 2008, Piquet Jr. had scored 13 points to Alonso's 28. So Alonso had more than double. And remember that this was a time when only 10 points were awarded for a win, down to 1 point for 8th place. And therefore, because of his, I suppose I could call it, iffy form, Piquet had come under increasing pressure throughout the season, and there were rumours swirling around the Formula One paddocks and therefore being written about by journalists, etc., about him possibly losing his Renault drive if things didn't improve pretty damn quick.
But there was that win for Alonso at Singapore, which we'll come back to big time in a moment, followed by another at the next race in Japan. So the year was saved. Renault stayed in F1 and Nelsinho was retained for 2009, at least initially. But after a dismal first half of the new season, in which he was again outperformed by Alonso in what was admittedly a rather average car, he was given the boot by Renault and replaced by Romain Grosjean. And that proved a really significant move by Briatore, because, although he certainly didn't know it at the time, Flav had, in effect, signed his own notice of dismissal.
Yes, you're right, and I think that's well put, because the Piquets, father and son, were both livid, absolutely livid, and they didn't hold back. In fact, had Nelsinho not been sacked, it's possible that we might never have heard of Crashgate. And indeed that the word Crashgate, if you can call it a word, might never have been coined. The secret might never have emerged, I mean. After all, it had held firm for almost a year, despite a few people being suspicious at the time.
Matt, why don't you go back and set the scene for us for the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix.
Okay, so it was Formula One's very first night race, and fact alert, and I was there. By the way, were you there?
No.
Weren't on that one, but I was there working for McLaren as the team's comms and PR chief, and the whole weekend had a surreal feel to it. Everything felt different. Why? Well, it was a brand new venue for a start, a brand new country for a championship status Formula One race. We all arrived at the circuit every day at about 2:00 in the afternoon, which felt weird. And we stayed there until well after midnight, sometimes 2 or 3 in the morning, in fact, which also felt weird and unfamiliar to most of us, those of us who are not mechanics, I should say. Anyway, it was therefore hard to sleep in sufficiently in the mornings. So we were all pretty knackered most of the time. And of course, it was boiling hot and incredibly humid in both paddock and pit lane, even at night. Anyway, so on top of all of that, a little while after the race, in which our number one driver, McLaren's number one driver, Lewis Hamilton, had finished third, which actually, I have to say, had disappointed us, no fault of Lewis's, but had disappointed us because he'd qualified on the front row and he was gunning for the World Championship, and we'd therefore been hoping that he was going to win the race. Anyway, one of our senior engineers, I probably better not say who, but one of our senior engineers came up to me in the paddock and said, "Do you think the timing of Piquet's shunt was iffy, Matt?" Call me naive, but I replied, well, lucky, yes, because it advantaged Alonso, obviously. He wouldn't have won without it, would he? And my colleague smiled, looked pensive, paused, and finally said, "Exactly." Honestly, I didn't think much more about it at the time, truth be told. I thought my mate, my colleague, was indulging in a bit of conspiracy theory fantasy. To be honest, I simply couldn't imagine that a Formula One team would deliberately shunt one of its drivers to advantage the other. As I say, call me naive if you like.
No, I think that would have been most people's reaction.
Do you?
Actually. Yep.
Yeah.
It was certainly mine to begin with. Crashing on purpose just seemed like an unthinkable idea.
Exactly.
I mean, Nino Farina, the very first world champion back in 1950, he wasn't above intimidating his rivals. And we all remember the semi-staged collisions between Senna and Prost at Suzuka in 89 and 90. And then Michael Schumacher barging into Damon Hill at Adelaide in 94.
And Jerez in 97 and various other things.
All that. But at least those incidents occurred sort of in the heat of competition. The idea of going out with the premeditated intention of crashing to affect the outcome of a race seemed utterly contrary to everything we'd grown up with, didn't it?
I agree with you. It did. And as I say, nonetheless, and thank you for not saying that I was naive, although I do think in some ways, in retrospect, I was. But anyway, I dismissed the idea out of hand. So let's get back on with our story. Now sacked, Piquet Junior didn't hold back. He was livid, as I said, and so was his father. In an interview with Auto Sprint, the famous Italian magazine, he, Piquet Junior, launched a scathing attack on Briatore, saying, and this is a quote but also a translation, "Flavio is a businessman, but he doesn't understand shit about Formula One. He's my manager, but in his role of team principal, he doesn't respect me. He only thinks about money, about how much money he can pocket in everything he's involved with. He's a man with no friends," end quote. And then in a formal statement, he, Nelsinho, added, quote, "A manager is supposed to encourage you, support you, and provide you with opportunities. In my case, it was the opposite. Flavio Briatore was my executioner," unquote.
Blimey. Extremely strong words
Very strong.
from Junior.
Very strong.
And his dad was just as angry, Nelson Sr. After he'd found out his son was going to be sacked, which was before it was actually made public, he went to see Max Mosley, our old friend, the president of the FIA in Monaco, to tell him about the deliberate crash involving his son in Singapore almost a year earlier. But actually, Mosley already knew the story. Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise.
Because Piquet Senior had spilled the beans to another senior FIA person much earlier, albeit without intending anything to happen, at least while his boy was still in a job. In interviews for a 2021 documentary film about Max Mosley called Mosley, It's Complicated.
Which is worth watching.
Yep, indeed. The former F1 race director, the late Charlie Whiting, revealed that Nelson Sr. had first mentioned the subject with him at the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, 5 weeks after Singapore. And that was the dramatic season finale where Lewis Hamilton was crowned champion ahead of Felipe Massa. Charlie Whiting said, quote, "There were a few conspiracy theories after the race, but nothing of any great substance. But it was in Brazil, and I was talking to Nelson Piquet Senior. I was his mechanic for a number of years at Brabham, and we'd remained good friends. He came to see me in my office, and we were having a chat. And then, all of a sudden, he shut the door. He held his foot against the door so no one could come in. And then he told me about what had happened in Singapore. It was aimed at Flavio because, basically, the essence of what he was saying was, Flavio made my boy crash. I said, wow, this is pretty serious stuff. I don't know who else he'd told, but he just said, keep it to yourself. In doing that, he would have known that I'd tell Max."
That's a very typical nuance of Formula One.
Totally.
Nelson Piquet said, don't tell anyone, but he both knew and intended that Charlie would tell Max, and he knew he would.
Yep, pure Formula One. That.
Yeah.
And Nelson Sr. would later tell investigators that he chose not to pursue the situation further at the time because he was worried it would impact his son's career negatively, which is probably a very fair assumption. I mean, as it turned out, Nelsinho didn't race in F1 after the scandal became public.
Yes, that's right. So the wider world found out about the whole thing on August the 31st, 2009, the day after the 2009 Belgian Grand Prix, which is a significant detail, as I'll explain in a minute. Anyway, what did we find out? We found out that the FIA was, quote, investigating alleged incidents at a previous Formula One event, unquote. Vague wording, I think you'd agree, although by that point, everyone was pretty sure it was Singapore. Actually, Brazilian television, who really would know, because they were very well informed by the Piquets, particularly Piquet Senior, had already said as much on air. But in reality, Mosley, the FIA president, as you've already said, but also a former barrister and as crafty as they come, had been working behind the scenes for a little while already. After Mosley's chat with Piquet Senior in Monaco, Mosley, had arranged for Piquet Junior to go to the FIA headquarters in Paris to make a signed statement of his version of events. But even so, Mosley feared that Piquet Junior's statement wouldn't actually be enough evidence on its own. Mosley later said, quote, I knew that even if I were to produce this statement, he means Piquet Junior's statement, with the whole story, and even if Nelson Jr. were to give evidence, the team's defence would be, well, we've just fired him. He's just being spiteful. He's just trying to cause trouble, unquote.
Fair enough.
And one thing you can say about Max Mosley, he was a good strategist. Mm-hmm. He was good at working out what might happen if this happened and what might not happen if this didn't happen, etc. Anyway, according to Mosley, it was only after investigators and lawyers had been sent to the 2009 Belgian Grand Prix, which I mentioned earlier, to interview members of the Renault team that he felt there was finally enough evidence to take the matter to the FIA World Motorsport Council. To quote Mosley again, if I may, the first person they summoned was Fernando Alonso, and he denied all knowledge of what had happened. A lot of people probably think that Alonso knew, in other words, knew all about it, but it's interesting that the chief superintendent, who had enormous experience of interrogating people, told me that he was convinced that Alonso was telling the truth. So that was fine. This is Mosley speaking still. And this is Mosley continuing. But then the next one they summoned was Pat Simmons. And Pat, of course, is a completely honest person. So when he was asked the obvious question, he said, I can't answer that question. Of course, the minute he said that, that was as good as a confession. So we then summoned Flavio Briatore in front of the FIA World Motorsport Council, and the rest is sort of history. End of Moseley quote. Richard, when you heard the news that the race was being looked into, what were your first thoughts?
Well, it was obviously worrying in terms of the breach of sporting ethics that it implied. But also, given some of the people involved, it wasn't actually as surprising as it might have been. What was your reaction, Matt?
Well, my reaction, kind of obviously, was that I immediately was reminded of the chat that I'd had with my McLaren colleague, the senior engineer, just a couple of hours after the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix had finished. And I thought, how naive I've been. Of course it must have been a deliberate ruse. It all seems so bloody obvious now. But as I say, at the time, I dismissed my colleague's suspicions as silly nonsense. But in my defence, I suppose I will say, don't forget, this was 2008, the year after Spygate, when McLaren had been fined $100 million after one of our engineers had been found to be in possession of 780 pages of Ferrari technical drawings. So, since we'd paid the fine and we were now in contention for the Formula One World Championship, the 2008 World Championship, back from the brink, if you like, the last thing we wanted to do was start casting aspersions at other teams. Put it this way, and I remember this so well, I remember the vibe, I remember what the atmosphere was like in every meeting and in every email we sent and received. In 2008, everyone at McLaren was focused on two things. One, trying to win the World Championship with Lewis, and two, trying to avoid controversy wherever possible.
So, on September the 4th, 2009, Renault were formally accused of interfering with the outcome of the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix. And over the course of that month, we'd learn more or less exactly what had occurred on that fateful day. And we'll go through the details after this short break.
Life is busy, but often the hardest thing about work is the constant noise and distractions. I sat down to write this ad and a text went ping and an email went ding, and that made me realise I hadn't replied to someone from yesterday, and guess what? I'm going to be late for my next meeting too. Yep, it's more challenging than ever to meet the demands of today's competing priorities without some help. And that's where Grammarly comes in. Grammarly is the essential AI communication assistant that boosts productivity so you can get more of what you need done faster, no matter what or where you're writing. And sure, Grammarly can help with your spelling and grammar, but what I like best is that it works seamlessly in the apps you already use, like Slack, Gmail, Office and Outlook, without any need to copy and paste. In fact, 90% of professionals say Grammarly has saved them time writing and editing their work. So let Grammarly take the busy work off of your plate so you can focus on high-impact work. Download Grammarly for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast.
Let's rewind the clock again, Matt, and go back to late September 2008 and that first ever F1 night race in Singapore. As you touched on earlier, there was an enormous buzz about the race, wasn't there? And Bernie Ecclestone, the F1 ringmaster, had added various other new races to the calendar over the years. Some of them had been more popular than others, but the feeling was that this was going to be a real winner.
Yes, absolutely. A game changer, perhaps even. As I said earlier, everything about Singapore was all new, and everything about it felt all new as well.
Exactly. And we mentioned earlier how Renault were under massive pressure to win before the season was out, and Singapore was the fourth from last race on the calendar. And actually things looked quite positive for what's often called Team Enstone from the start of the weekend, with Alonso buoyed by a new blend of ELF fuel, providing a significant power boost, going fastest of all in FP2 and FP3.
A little bit of casual chemistry from Richard Williams there.
Failed O-level chemistry, in fact. They still didn't have the fastest car, but on a brand new street track, where everyone was effectively starting with a blank piece of paper, Alonso felt he could make the difference. And sixth in the first part of qualifying seemed to back that up. But then a fuel feed problem left him stranded on the track in Q2 and saddled him with 15th place on the starting grid. And that was a massive blow when things had been going pretty well.
Absolutely. And I think that's very key because it's at that point of the weekend when the Renault guys must have been starting to get desperate. 15th on the grid, needing a win. So it was at that moment that the idea of staging a deliberate crash to bring Alonso back into contention for victory by hook or by crook must have first come up. The idea, just to be clear, the idea would be for Renault to pit Alonso early, then have Piquet deliberately bring out the safety car. Because in those days, of course, a safety car would mean a closed pit lane, meaning that Alonso, tyres already changed, would be able to jump up the order while everyone else was pitting for fresh rubber once the safety car period had ended. Of course, what we don't know is who came up with the idea.
That's right, and this is where it gets murky. In the first of his 2 sworn statements, which was leaked in the media, Nelson Junior said, quote, "The proposal to deliberately cause an accident was made to me shortly before the race took place, when I was summoned by Mr. Briatore and Mr. Simmons in Mr. Briatore's office. Mr. Simmons, in the presence of Mr. Briatore, asked me if I would be willing to sacrifice my race for the team by, quote, causing a safety car, end quote." He added that at the time of this conversation with Briatore and Simmons, he was, quote, "in a very fragile and emotional state of mind," end quote, because of the intense stress brought about by Briatore failing to confirm whether he'd be retained for 2009. So, according to Piquet Junior, again, quote, "I accepted because I hoped that it could improve my position within the team at this critical time in the race season. At no point was I told by anyone that by agreeing to cause an incident, I would be guaranteed a renewal of my contract or any other advantage. However, in the context, I thought that it would be helpful in achieving this goal. I therefore agreed to cause the incident," end quote.
Interesting you use the word murky. I mean, it is developing into a murky tale as we're telling it, isn't it? Mm-hmm. The more I think about it. I mean, it'd be a good movie, wouldn't it?
Who'd play Flav?
Oh, well.
James Gandolfini's gone, unfortunately. Sorry.
Yeah. We'll continue that discussion later. Anyway, back to our story. In his written testimony, Simmons said, quote, "The idea was first suggested to me by Nelson Piquet Junior, unquote. Simmons added that he, quote, "should have dismissed it immediately. It is to my eternal regret and shame that I did not do so. I can only say that I did it out of a misguided devotion to my team and not for any personal gain whatsoever," unquote.
So come on, Matt. Who do you think is more likely to have come up with the idea? Nelsinho being bullied by Briatore and looking to curry favour with the team with his seat on the line? Or Simmons, the brilliant engineer and Enstone loyalist, desperate to save his team's future?
Well, I've known Pat for 30 years, more than 30 years. I like him. We get on well. We've hobnobbed on flights to Grand Prix. We've hobnobbed in airport lounges and so on and off throughout that time. We've even had dinner together in London. And let's just be clear, for the avoidance of doubt, as they say, even Mosley described him as, and we've already mentioned this, but I'll repeat it, quote, "a completely honest person," unquote. Even though Max describing him in that way wouldn't actually have been in the best interests of his best efforts to secure the verdict that at the time he wanted to secure, or to establish a deterrent that would prevent other teams trying something similarly dodgy in future, or to make sure that justice was seen to be done with maximum force, which was very much the way Max liked to operate. And all that was clearly what Mosley was hell-bent on achieving. So what can I say in answer to your question? I don't really know Piquet Junior, although I had the odd chat with him in 2007 in particular, when he was the Renault test and reserve driver and I was still a full-time journalist, not having yet joined McLaren, which I joined in 2008. But as I say, I know Simmons well. So of the two, if you force me to choose, the one I'd choose to believe is Simmons.
What we do know is that after the dastardly deed had been thought up, a detailed analysis of the Singapore circuit map was undertaken to identify exactly where the recovery cranes were positioned. And it was concluded that if the crash was staged at the tight turn 17, where there were no cranes and there was no easy access to the track, a safety car would be necessary. And in the event, they were bang on with their thinking.
Yes, it was very meticulously planned in that way. Also, Piquet Junior said in his statement that Simmons had warned him to, quote, be careful, unquote, which he took to mean that he, Nelsinho, should be careful not to hurt himself. But other than that, his only instruction appears to have been what corner on what lap to crash on. And so it was that on lap 14, 2 laps after Alonso had made a surprisingly early stop for fuel and tyres, with Ferrari's Felipe Massa leading from McLaren's Lewis Hamilton, Piquet Junior stuffed it into the wall at turn 17, just as planned. Or was it just as planned? Because, according to the race's Mark Hughes, fine journalist, who wrote a good piece on Crashgate in the race's website in April 2023, so many years later, on being asked over the radio to, quote, push, unquote, Piquet Junior had planned to spin deliberately at the exit of turn 17, and he'd do that after applying too much throttle so as to power slide the right rear wheel into the barrier. So it would be a harmless low-speed accident, but one that would block the track. And he'd even actually done a practice spin on the reconnaissance lap to the grid. But as things panned out, the accident he ended up having was not the accident he was trying to have. And to quote Mark Hughes again in the race's website, quote, crashing deliberately is such an unnatural thing to do, and he was overcautious with his speed. As he stood on the gas to induce the power slide and kept his foot down, the car looped around, but without hitting the barriers on the right, as intended. Instead, it continued spinning and hit the opposite wall side on with considerable force. There was real concern on the Renault pit wall that Piquet might have injured himself. Thankfully, he was okay, unquote.
Well, that just underlines the degree of recklessness involved, doesn't it? Not only might Piquet Junior have been hurt, but so too, as you said earlier, could another driver or a marshal or even a spectator. I mean, morally, there's no defending it, is there, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably talk about that a bit later once we've got through the saga itself. But yeah, obviously, of course, it was potentially dangerous. But there's nothing really for me to say more at this point, I think, other than, which I think I will repeat, what Pat himself said, which was that he admitted that he should have dismissed the idea immediately. He conceded that it really was to his eternal regret and shame that he didn't do so, and he added, quote, I can only say that I did it out of a misguided devotion to my team and not for any personal gain whatsoever, unquote, and I believe that. But I'm going to just add a little bit of context which you may or may not take issue with or regard as relevant, if I may, Richard.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Well, I like what the famous American writer and teacher Dale Carnegie, I'm sure you've read all of him.
Oh, of course. Yes.
All.
I'm a big fan of self-improvement.
Of course, yes. Well, you are unimprovable. Anyway, Dale Carnegie said this, quote, there is a certain degree of satisfaction in having the courage to admit one's errors. It not only clears up the air of guilt and defensiveness, but it also helps solve the problem created by the error, unquote. Well, having made an error, Simmons then behaved exactly in accordance with what Carnegie had recommended years before, didn't he? In other words, he made a mistake and he admitted it.
Yeah, and coming back to what Mark Hughes wrote, it's interesting what he said about Piquet Junior having the wrong kind of accident, because the Brazilian himself said that after the race, his engineer, who hadn't been let in on the plan, questioned the nature of the crash because he found it unusual. Quote, I believe that a clever engineer would notice from the car's telemetry that I caused the incident on purpose as I continued accelerating, whereas a normal reaction would be to brake as soon as possible.
That is interesting, isn't it? But anyway, if you'll let me make a joke at this point, may I?
By all means.
Well, after all, Colossally is supposed to be entertaining as well as informative, and we're not actually in a court of law here. I reckon the riskiest thing about the Crashgate plan is that it required Piquet Junior to get to lap 14 on a tight street circuit without having an unplanned crash. Because he hadn't been particularly crash-averse so far that season anyway, had he?
Cruel, but not inaccurate.
They must have been sitting there over those 13 laps saying, don't shunt, mate, don't shunt.
Don't shunt before Alonso.
Exactly.
Exactly. His tyres.
Yes. I mean, that could easily have happened and completely spoilt the whole thing. Anyway, he managed to get to lap 14 and do the shunt as planned, or more or less as planned. Anyway, to be serious once again and to return to the narrative of the race, the upshot of the incident was that Alonso moved up to fifth, with all the cars ahead of him still having to pit again. Massa, meanwhile, and this made it even easier for Renault, really, Massa, who'd been cruising towards a likely lights-to-flag victory, had his race turned on its head after a truly disastrous Ferrari pit stop. In the panic to get him refueled and back out on track, and with the other Ferrari, Kimi Raikkonen's, stacked just behind, Massa, was given the signal to go before the fuel hose had been detached. So Massa duly drove down to the end of the pit lane, trailing the fuel hose behind him, before finally being told to stop. And by the time he'd been wheeled back and the fuel hose had been removed, he was stone last. And he still, poor chap, still had to serve a penalty for an unsafe release. So that completely wrecked his race and ultimately, you could say, his world championship. But more on that later.
Yeah, we will return to that. But it's interesting that Alonso said immediately after the race that if it hadn't been for the safety car, he'd have finished 14th or 15th. He added, "We chose a very aggressive strategy and we had a bit of luck." Well, you could say that.
You could say that.
We've already quoted from Nelson's first statement on the crash a year later, but it's worth stating that the day after it was leaked to the media, September the 11th, 2009, Renault, meaning Flavio Briatore and Pat Symonds, stated that they intended to take legal action against Piquet Junior and his father for, quote, the making of false allegations and a related attempt to blackmail the team into allowing Mr. Piquet Junior to drive for the remainder of the 2009 season, end quote. But they wouldn't get very far with that action. 5 days later, the Renault team announced that it would not be contesting the charges at the meeting of the World Motorsport Council set for the following week, adding that both Briatore and Symonds had now left the team. Quote, "I was just trying to save the team," unquote, Briatore said. "It's my duty. That's the reason I've finished." Well, I'm not sure whether that's falling on your sword or being pushed onto it.
Yeah. Yes, well, look, I think Briatore's days at Renault were numbered by that time, and he probably would have been pushed if he hadn't jumped. Anyway, despite his and Symonds' departures, and despite Renault admitting that they wouldn't contest the charges, the extraordinary meeting of the FIA World Motorsport Council still went ahead as planned on September the 21st, 2009. And in it, Renault stated at the council that it had conducted a detailed internal investigation which had found that Briatore, Symonds and Piquet Junior had conspired to cause the crash and that no other team member was involved in the conspiracy. However, it was revealed that another individual at Renault, the so-called Witness X, whose identity was never revealed, did know about the conspiracy, but that he wasn't a conspirator himself. And in fact, it was Witness X's testimony that confirmed many of the details of what did happen, including the fact, it's quite important fact, that Briatore had known about the crash plan before it had been put into effect.
Yeah, that was the clincher. And after a 90-minute hearing, the council imposed a disqualification on Renault, suspended for 2 years. Briatore was banned indefinitely from any FIA-sanctioned event, arguably the biggest individual ban in motor racing history. And furthermore, Briatore was indefinitely banned from managing drivers, with the FIA saying that super licenses would not be issued or renewed to drivers associated with him, of whom Alonso was one. Pat Symonds was given a 5-year ban, while Piquet Junior avoided a penalty, and that was his reward for spilling the beans in the first place. We mentioned earlier that Max Mosley's investigator deemed Fernando Alonso to have known nothing of the plot, and the council agreed, so Alonso escaped any punishment and maintains to this day that he still counts Singapore 2008 as a win, which, in the record book, it is. Nevertheless, a number of people doubted whether Alonso could have known nothing of the plan, including Felipe Massa, surprise, surprise, the man who suffered most by losing the World Championship. What do you think, Matt? Do you think a mind as shrewd as Fernando's wouldn't have questioned his highly unusual race strategy, stopping so early for fuel and tyres? It's my hunch, and only a hunch, that he was told to come in for that weirdly premature stop, but not explicitly given the reason, just maybe a nod and a wink. And that would have given him what's known to the legal profession as plausible deniability.
Well, it's not an impossible theory what you've just described there, but I don't know, and that's because no one can know.
And that feels like a good time for our final ad break.
We're going to dedicate the final part of this podcast to looking at the fallout from Crashgate, both in the short term and the long term, because, as you'd expect, there was plenty. Two of Renault's main sponsors, ING, a global bank based in the Netherlands, I think, weren't they?
Yep.
And Mutua Madrilena, a Spanish insurance company. Anyway, they both pulled out straight away, leaving the team with a rather bad-looking car for the next race. Ironically, the 2009 Singapore Grand Prix. Mutua Madrilena said that the scandal, quote, could affect the image, reputation and good name of the team's sponsors, unquote. And that was probably a fair assessment, wasn't it, Richard?
Yeah, very fair, I think. And do remember that this was a very turbulent time in F1. It wasn't just the fallout from the global financial crisis of 2008. Crashgate happened in the middle of a huge battle between the FIA and FOTA, the Formula One Teams Association, over Max Mosley's plans for a $40 million cost cap. Piero Ferrari, Enzo's son, actually rang me in the middle of all that to tell me that if Mosley got his way, Ferrari would withdraw completely from F1. And all that would eventually lead to Mosley's decision not to stand for a 5th term as president. Then there was a lot of distress caused by Ecclestone's decision to take the British Grand Prix away from Silverstone and give it to Donington Park on a 17-year deal. And that fell through when the Donington people couldn't raise the money to bring their track up to spec. But it did allow Bernie to go back and make a much better deal with Silverstone. So, all round, F1 was not already doing itself any favours in terms of its reputation as a stable and well-run sport when the big scandal of Crashgate blew up. And in 2010, Renault sold 75% of their F1 team to Genii Capital, a Luxembourg investment firm, and a year later, they sold the rest to what became Lotus F1.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, it was an extremely turbulent time in Formula One. And you'll remember that the Renault Formula One team, when Briatore was still running it, had initially launched legal proceedings against the Piquets, insinuating that Piquet Junior had lied and even suggesting blackmail. So, in light of the World Motorsport Council outcome, the Piquets won a libel case against the Renault Formula One team in the High Court, and Renault apologised and agreed to pay damages. But Briatore himself also went to court, suing the FIA personally for his lifetime ban and claiming that there had been several miscarriages of justice.
He actually gave me a scoop on that for The Guardian. He and his French lawyer, a man called Philippe Wacra, got in touch.
Well pronounced.
Wacra. Got in touch And they showed me some documents they'd submitted to France's Tribunal de Grande Instance.
You're doing pretty well. I thought I was doing well with Mutua Madrilena.
Come on, Siri, pull it together.
Okay, sorry.
Together. These documents accused Max Mosley of, quote, assuming the roles of complainant, investigator, prosecutor, and judge, end quote. And they were asking not just for the setting aside of Briatore's lifetime ban, but for €1 million in damages.
€1 million, pretty penny. Sure enough, in early 2010, the French court overturned Briatore's ban and awarded him €15,000 in compensation. Not quite $1 million.
Not even close.
Not quite $1 million. While Simmons was awarded €5,000 in compensation, in addition to having his ban overturned. The FIA were not happy about any of this at all. But in the end, in early April 2010, the FIA, announced a settlement with Briatore and Simmons, which led to both men agreeing not to work in Formula One until 2013 or in any other FIA championship until 2011. As we know, the time passed and Pat would go on to work for the Virgin Racing, Manor, Marussia Formula One team, all of those names being the same team, then for Williams, before finding his way to Formula One management itself, in fact, where, as Chief Technical Officer, he was a key architect of the current rule set. And he's now Executive Engineering Consultant with Cadillac as they prepare to enter Formula One in 2026. And Pat has been fully accepted back into Formula One, fully and unequivocally, having held up his hands and having admitted his mistake.
Yeah, I think that acceptance came because he's generally thought of as being one of the good guys.
Absolutely.
Flav is a slightly different matter. He came into F1 in the early 90s through his association with the Benetton clothing company, knowing absolutely nothing about the sport. But he was a colourful figure with an interesting, slightly opaque background, and he showed very quickly that he wanted to be a disruptor. In his view, F1 should concentrate on providing entertainment. And you remember, Matt, that his first idea was to recommend reversed grids with the slowest qualifiers at the front. And I have to say, imbecilic barely covers that.
Well, say what you mean, Richard, please.
I will. Actually, I remember being invited to talk to Flav about the idea of ghostwriting his autobiography.
Oh, I wish you'd done it. I wish you'd done it. You would have had so many stories about...
Well, hang on. I didn't actually want to ghostwrite anyone's autobiography at the time, but Flav's mysterious background did make it seem worth exploring. So we had a chat about it, during which I told him very clearly that from my point of view, it would only be worth doing if he was absolutely open and honest about everything. And, surprise, surprise, I never heard from him on that subject.
Fancy that.
Just fancy that. Bernie liked him a lot, though. They're still close friends. So what one of the Piquets said about Flav having no friends isn't quite true.
True.
He's got Bernie.
Not true.
And in 2007, the year before the events of Crashgate, Flav and Bernie had gone into partnership with Lakshmi Mittal, the Indian steel billionaire, as co-owners of Queen's Park Rangers, the London football club, who were then in the championship, the second tier. They decided that getting the club promoted to the Premier League would give them access to another money-making machine. And Flav had spotted Loftus Road from his helicopter while flying from his home in Chelsea to the factory at Enstone in Oxfordshire. He'd actually never been to a game there.
Not very thorough due diligence.
It's a form of it.
Yes.
And you can see how that worked out in a fabulously bizarre BBC documentary from 2011 called The 4-Year Plan.
Which I haven't seen. Do you think I should?
Oh, you tonight, go home and watch it. It's
all right.
It's priceless.
It's a plan.
And the revelations of Crashgate, of course, made people in football question whether Flav passed the supposed fit and proper person test for ownership of an English league football club. He stepped down as chairman of QPR in 2010, and a year later, he and Bernie sold their shares to the Malaysian billionaire Tony Fernandez.
Who'd also got involved, Tony Fernandez this is, with Formula One via his Caterham team. No wonder when Briatore opened a club in Sardinia and a line of expensive clothing he called his brand Billionaire.
Well, small world, the world of billionaires.
It is. Actually, here's a funny story about Briatore. Well, I think it's a funny story anyway. In what year would it have been? 2005. I think 2005, when I was still a full-time journalist, not having yet joined McLaren, and the Formula One World Championship was being duked out between Renault and McLaren, if you remember. Flavio got it into his head that I was biased in favour of McLaren. And he told his comms and PR chief, Patrizia Spinelli, do you remember her?
I remember her very well.
There you are, yes. He told her to give me a bollocking about it, which she duly did. Actually, more than once. At various points, in fact, during the 2005 season, was I given that bollocking. By the way, I like Patrizia, but she was good at giving bollockings.
You would know this, actually. Our comms and PR chiefs actually allowed to administer bollockings to journalists.
It's part of the job description.
Is it? Okay.
It is. I've never given you one, and I don't think I ever will.
Thank you.
Anyway, back to my little story, which I think is a funny story. At the tail end of the season, 2005 season, as bad luck would have it, remember Flavio already thinking that I was biased in favour of McLaren, Flavio spotted me and Ron Dennis having dinner one evening in a restaurant in Shanghai. Alonso had already won the Drivers' World Championship in the previous race, Japan, Suzuka, but the Constructors' World Championship was still up for grabs in China between Renault and McLaren. Flavio slowly walked past Ron's and my table, then took a step back, stopped, stared, looked us both up and down, said nothing, then went silently on his way. Anyway, the next day I bumped into him, Flavio, in the paddock. Again, he stopped, stared, looked me up and down, then drawled, "English mafia." From Flavio, I don't know whether that was an insult or a compliment. What do you reckon?
Probably unwise to push that one too far, Matt.
They're probably...
Capiche?
Capiche. Anyway, back to our story. What of Nelson Piquet Junior? That's a loose end we need to tie up. Well, the Crashgate saga well and truly killed off his Formula One career, didn't it? Although he hadn't exactly been going great guns before Crashgate, had he? Mm-hmm. But many pundits, including driver-turned-commentator Martin Brundle, who I have a lot of respect for, by the way, and I'm sure you do as well, Richard, many of them were left shocked and stunned that Piquet Junior had escaped personal punishment when he'd admitted race fixing, which I suppose he did admit race fixing. But he did escape punishment, and actually he was crowned the inaugural FIA Formula E champion in 2015. Richard, do you think Brundle was right to question why Piquet wasn't punished?
Yeah, I think Martin was absolutely right. And you have to wonder why owning up to a crime would completely absolve you from paying a price for it. And with hindsight, we can say that Piquet's actions actually had the effect of preventing another Brazilian from winning the F1 world title.
I suppose it's like turning Queen's evidence, really, isn't it, in a sense?
I suppose it is, yeah, but I mean, I don't think there's any law that says that you can't be punished.
No, I just
even if you
thought I'd draw the analogy, yeah.
Anyway, assuming Felipe Massa had collected that victory in Singapore, as he seemed destined to do, he'd have gone on into the 2008 title finale in Brazil around 3 points ahead of Lewis Hamilton, depending on where Lewis would have finished that race without Piquet's interruption. Massa's subsequent win at Interlagos and Hamilton's fifth place would have had Massa winning the title by a likely 9 points. And at that time, despite their suspicions, Massa and Ferrari chose not to pursue legal action. But that's since changed, thanks to an intervention a couple of years ago by one Bernard Charles Eccleston.
Indeed, but there is a little phrase that I'm going to use now. Woulda, coulda, shoulda. I mean, you can't just extrapolate like that. Had Massa entered the 2008 title finale in Brazil 3 points ahead of Hamilton, McLaren would have hatched a a more aggressive race strategy for Lewis for that race. Don't forget I was there. I was in the pits. I was in the paddock.
What, you mean they'd have tried to win the race and they didn't?
Yeah, I do mean that. I think they were, I was part of the team. I think they
Fair
were
enough.
looking to score enough points to win the World Championship and therefore temporarily and perhaps injudiciously, riskily, abandoned the normal objective, which is to try and win the race. Anyway, that's my theory, and it's another conversation, and I might be wrong and I might be right. But in general, if one thing changes, everything changes. It's like, there's Sliding Doors, the famous movie Sliding Doors. Or to put it another way, if Massa had won the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix, everything that happened after that, absolutely everything, would have panned out differently.
Well, that's your woulda, coulda, shoulda, Matt.
Well, yeah, maybe.
Of course you can extrapolate. And the odds on a Massa title, which he almost won anyway, would certainly have improved.
Yeah, look, yes, they'd have improved, certainly. I agree with you. But once you change one variable, you can't extrapolate on the assumption that the other variables wouldn't also change. We don't have to agree, by the way, Richard.
And that's the joy of F1 and of our podcast. One man's unwarranted extrapolation is another man's cast iron certainty.
Well said. Well said. Anyway, yes, in a March 2023 interview with the German website F1 Insider, Bernie Ecclestone, who was, of course, Formula One's chief executive officer at the time of Crashgate, indicated that he and Mosley, quote, had enough information in time to investigate the matter, unquote, but actually that they'd chosen to do nothing so as to, quote, protect the sport and save it from a huge scandal, unquote. And that may be true. But you never know with Bernie. Anyway.
I'll stop laughing.
Okay. Having said that, Bernie also added that under the statutes, the Singapore Grand Prix should have been annulled, which would have made Massa Formula One world champion. So it's perhaps understandable, because of all that Felipe was fuming when he read those comments, prompting him to send a so-called letter before claim to both Formula One management and the FIA. And Richard, we haven't had an update on the Massa legal case for a while, have we? And nor, therefore, do we really know whether he's seeking to reverse the World Championship result or simply claim some financial compensation. But does he have a case, do you reckon? I mean, should anything be done? I'll answer my question first and then you answer it. In my view, the answer to my question is no. In all sport, you play to the whistle, or at least until such time as the window for normal sporting appeals is closed. I mean, should we now lobby, we Englishmen, for the quarter-final match between Argentina and England in the 1986 World Cup to be annulled, because of Maradona's infamous Hand of God goal? No, in my opinion, no, obviously not. Okay, obviously it was wrong. Obviously, it was a handball, but it was 39 years ago. Crashgate was 17 years ago, which is also a long time ago. So, in my view, I'm sorry, Felipe, but the ship has sailed, the horse has bolted, the fat lady has sung, the case is closed.
Ah, yes, and Lewis Hamilton didn't win an 8th world title at Abu Dhabi in 2021. The fat lady sang then too.
Yeah.
And not a happy tune.
Yes, I agree with you. And sadly, it's too late to do anything about that awful aberration too. The awful aberration being Abu Dhabi 2021. I was there in Abu Dhabi in 2021, working as comms and PR chief for Aston Martin, not McLaren, by now. And I watched the race and the drama unfold from my office in the team's paddock hospitality unit with TV and data screens in front of me. And I remember yelling at the telly, or the TV screens, as so many people listening to this podcast right now probably remember yelling at their tellies at home. That was a proper FIA balls up, wasn't it?
Yeah, and degree of culpability never to be established.
Also. Anyway, this is worth just saying. It's a bit of a cul-de-sac, well, not a cul-de-sac, but it's a little bit of a diversion. But anyway, after the race, I'm talking about Abu Dhabi 2021 now, although the team that I was working for, Aston Martin, was completely uninvolved in the controversy and therefore had nothing either to gain or to lose, I found that I was I was almost shaking with rage. So I remember I marched down to Mercedes' paddock hospitality unit, where I saw Toto Wolff in earnest dialogue with my oppo, my opposite number there, Bradley Lord. And I said to them, I hope you're going to protest that. That we will, they replied. But that's another episode, and it's another podcast, unless it's history too recently for Colossally. What do you reckon?
Oh, I don't know. We might bear that one in mind.
It is history. It did happen. It is in the past.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Crashgate. What more is there to say about Crashgate? Well, it was wrong. Of course it was wrong. We both agree and have made clear that we agree over the past hour that it was wrong. But I recall that a number of newspaper men, particularly those who weren't regular Formula One correspondents, and I don't mean you, I know you write about lots of stuff, but you, au fond, you are a Formula One expert. But a lot of them castigated Crashgate in what I thought at the time, was ludicrously over-the-top language. People saying it was the worst event in sporting history, blah, blah, blah. And remember that I was working for McLaren at the time. So from a purely selfish point of view, you might have expected me to welcome the acres of newsprint that was devoted to vilifying a rival team, but I didn't. And look, as we've both said, Crashgate was wrong. But now I'm going to say something that I don't often say. In fact, I may never have said, ever. I'm going to say I agree with Eddie Irvine, who said he thought the reaction to Crashgate was a little over the top, given that, whether we like it or not, Formula One teams have always bent the rules and done almost anything they could to win. So I'm not saying it was right, but I'm saying that the absolute castigation was over the top.
For once, Matt, I couldn't agree with you less. Or with Eddie Irvine, which is possibly less surprising.
Probably.
There's the kind of bending the rules that involves flexible wings and rocket fuel and even hidden traction control software. And that's the kind of thing that's always been intrinsic to F1. It's an extension of finding loopholes in the regulations, which is what all designers are paid to do. And that is a completely different thing from staging a crash that, as we both already said, might have killed another driver, a marshal, or a spectator. That is way beyond acceptability, and it needed exemplary punishment. Instead, everyone involved got off very lightly. But that's just me.
Look, I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying I thought some of the castigation were over the top. Shall we continue this discussion in the pub, my friend?
I see no alternative.
And that feels like a very good place to say, and colossally that's history, and wrap up our episode on one of the great Formula One controversies of our time. Now it's time for our regular questions segment, where we tackle questions sent in by the Race Members Club about our previous episode, which was on the great Jim Clark. The first one comes from History Guy 67, who says, do the two of you think that Jim Clark had reservations about driving Colin Chapman's cars? Clearly, Jochen Rindt did, but did safety ever start to come between Jim and Colin? What do you think, Richard?
Well, I've followed Jim Clark throughout his career pretty much from the beginning, and I think I've read all the available books and so on, and I have never come across anything that suggests that Jim had reservations about the safety of Colin Chapman's Lotuses. As History Guy suggests, we know that Jochen Rindt certainly did, because there is a letter, which is now in the public domain, that he wrote to Colin saying that, warning him that his cars were dangerous, and if they carried on, if he carried on with this absolute stress on lightness at all costs, making components light, he wouldn't be able to drive for him anymore.
Yeah, it's a remarkable letter, and the actual typed photocopy is available, on social media and on the internet, as you say. And it's phrased, very carefully. We must get a grip on this, Colin. I don't think he uses that phrase, but yes, because I've had too many shunts recently, all of which were a result of car failures. But do you think it was really bad luck that Jochen Rindt had more such failures than Jim Clark did? Or do you think it was partly a consequence of Jim Clark's great mechanical sympathy?
Well, we know all the drivers of Jim's era who had bad accidents driving Lotuses when half shafts or stub axles broke or suspension bits. And that didn't seem to happen to Jim so much. And it may have been that he did, as he did, have a very light touch at the wheel. He was very sensitive, sympathetic to the machinery. And maybe Jochen was a more aggressive driver, and that's probably true. Not faster, but more aggressive.
But very fast.
Of course, yeah, very fast. So maybe that's the answer, that the way Jim drove didn't take him into such jeopardy, as the way some others did. Our second question is from Max Campesano. And Max says, I'm wondering if you guys could talk about how Clark was so fast. I'm sure I've read somewhere that he essentially didn't know why he was so good and didn't understand why everyone else didn't drive like him. How did he compare to more technical or analytical drivers? And I'm not sure who a contemporary would have been, but think a Niki Lauda or a Michael Schumacher type. What made him so good? What do you think, Matt?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I'll answer it in two ways, if I may. Perhaps one of the reasons is what we've just touched on already, which is his great mechanical sympathy and the fact that he finessed his cars to the lap times that he could achieve and only he could achieve. Genius, if you want to call it that. And the second thing I'd say is that kind of sporting genius, or by the way, musical genius, or artistic genius, or literary genius. If you asked Shakespeare how he could write blank verse so beautifully, he'd just say, well, that's how it comes out.
It's what I do.
Yes. Yeah. If you asked Jacqueline Dupre how she could create tone from a cello that others couldn't, she'd find it hard to reply. If you said to David Beckham, how can you curl the ball round the wall when you're taking a free kick better than hit your contemporaries? And I know you've worked in more sports than I have, but do you agree? I mean, these people can just do it, but they don't always know how they can do it.
Yeah, I do. I mean, sort of inherent feel for whatever it is they're doing explains a lot of it and can't be explained. And of course, the 10,000 hours theory also comes into play. You have to practice like mad, or most people do. But it wasn't, I think Jim's era of drivers wasn't a particularly technical or analytical era. I don't think drivers thought about it in the way. I just read a fantastic thing. Carlos Sainz talking about adapting to a new team and a new car, and he was actually talking about Lewis Hamilton taking his place.
Very interesting insights.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
All the things that they have to take into consideration now and adjust to and have in their heads. And I don't think it was quite the same. I think, feel was much more important in those days.
I agree.
And if you'd like to ask a question about Crashgate, just head to patreon.com/therace and sign up to the Race Members Club. There's tons for you to enjoy over there, including ad-free access to all our shows and a load of bonus content. What's more, throughout May, we're giving you 75% off your first month of access as part of F1's 75th anniversary celebrations.
Yep. And remember, if you'd like to drop us a line, you can get in touch via podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop us a line via social media. I'm at the Bish1, and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
And that's it for this week. Until next time, with thanks to our producer Jonny Reynolds, who keeps us both out of the wall, and to you for listening, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
History.
The Athletic.